It's
Let
loading.
Enrico start.
Alright, we're live, I believe. Welcome everybody to the first official BMR podcast episode. Tonight the topic is going to be American railroading. We're joined by 3 Americans and 1 Dutchman.
Perfect.
Perfect, like always. On the left, top side is Kale, BMR
Hello.
member from the start, I believe, and one of the main
Founder.
founder, beside
Our,
the godfather
glorious
of
leader.
VMR.
our glorious leader.
Our glorious leader.
Benevolent overlord.
To the right is Chris, also a fellow BMR member and definitely a good builder.
Thank you.
I agree.
To the bottom right is Glenn, one of the
Hello. Still don't have a webcam.
still hasn't got a webcam right now, but he's one of the well-known builders. And
Or is he? Or his face really like that?
Oh, that's definitely what I look like.
we all know from his videos of
My
YouTube
face is
channel.
just my face is just the red Discord logo, and the rest of the time I have to wear a mask.
So the topic
And
is
of course we have Enrico.
yeah, of course we have me.
He's a Yeah, Glenn is just a sophisticated computer AI.
Correct.
An AI Lego builder.
That's the reason why I build so good.
So the topic is going to be American railroading, and we're going to discuss a couple of topics involving American railroading and American layouts. If you got any questions during this podcast, you can ask by using the live chat provided by YouTube itself. And we will be answering a couple of those questions, hopefully all of them after a couple of minutes. We keep track of all the good questions, all the bad questions, and all the funny questions. Without any further ado, let's get started, I believe.
We'll answer those questions towards the end of the podcast, and we'll aim to keep the podcast limited to 1 hour.
Yeah. We'll
Right.
try. We'll try.
We'll try. All right, topic number 1, Enrico.
Well, that's to start with the most difficult question. What defines an American layout?
Finding an American layout.
Hmm.
Well, I've actually thought about this for a good 5 minutes, and I think I have an appropriate answer. So, not just for American layouts, but also for just American railroading in general. I think one of probably the most defining characteristics of that is just huge rail yards and servicing.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of the old railroad films that I've seen, and a lot of them that are even publicly available online have some amount of footage of just you see the big like classification yards with the hump hills, so they push the cars up and they roll them down and sort them and classify them. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. And now for American layouts, it's you don't see the hump modeled or anything similar to that, but you do often see big yards where people will more manually sort out cars and stuff like that. Like in the Pednug layout, we have our huge wonderful yard that is really fun to not use currently.
And just display
And,
everything.
We're working on that.
Yeah,
We need to.
we're working on that. But also
We'll
in
get
like
rid of the.
traditional scales, you have like uh, just about almost on any layout that is more set up for the operating side of things, you'll see at least one decent sized yard where there'll pretty much always be a bunch of rolling stock and storage facilities and engine servicing stuff like that. I think that would probably be my answer.
Yeah. I was gonna say. Glenn kind of touched on it in a roundabout way, but probably American railroading, American model train layouts are just dominated by freight. Um, we, you know, everyone models freight operations. It seems no one, you know, um, and really railroads today in North America are just dominated by freight. We don't really have a whole lot of passenger rail, at least inner
Not
city
long
passenger rail.
distance,
Yeah, I mean we have Amtrak, but
but it's Amtrak.
Yeah, who
yeah.
cares about Amtrak?
But usually when you see a train, it's a freight train.
Yeah, exactly.
Freight just dominates everything in railroading for us. So occasionally you'll see someone modeling passenger operations, but for the most part, U.S. modelers are freight modelers.
Yeah, I think another difficulty is that the US passenger cars and trains were all just so long that to be able to just build a station and have all of the space that you need for a proper station and yard for passenger cars would just be enormous.
For realistic length
Yeah.
trains, I definitely agree because you
Yeah.
have more often than not you have passenger trains running up into like the 20 car range, and even
Mhm.
then you still have some trains running in sections.
Yeah.
And then you try to model that, and you're ending up with like 20 feet of just
Yeah.
passenger space.
And
Yeah, because I have 5 passenger cars, and each one of those is like 2 base plates long, and just that train takes up half my layout.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, even for just like a 5 or 6 car train with that kind of length of passenger car, it gets quite long.
And I don't want to build a station for that.
I do, but
Yeah.
it's gonna take a while.
I do, but I'll need to buy another house.
We have had a couple of plans for the replicate, obviously a compressed version of the train station in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We have slowly
Which
been
would still be
acquiring parts
huge.
for it. Yes, it would still be
Yeah.
huge. It's if you to give you some perspective, I think it's like Kale's Red Lion display. How much longer is it than your Red Lion display? It's like
Well, Red Lion is about 17 feet long.
it would be like
Lancaster would be about 20, I believe.
Okay,
it's
for
up
any European viewers, it's the American podcast. We are not going to translate or recalculate feet. We're just going to do everything in the in the metric, not in the metric system, but in the imperial system.
This is America, dang it.
Is
not
that
until I learn a second language.
This is
Reading
America,
units
damn
only.
it. This is America, dang it. We use imperial.
Reading units only. Yeah, I think those are all really good. Those are definitely really defining characteristics.
From
I
my
think, I think the other thing. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, my perspective as a European, American railroads are always the American general is always big and huge in size. So there is space in between the tracks, in between buildings, in between roads, and especially if you're doing a yard, for example, there need to be a bit of space everywhere. It doesn't need to be cramped and compressed together. And this is a difficult thing because you don't want to use too much space for a yard because then your entire layout turns into a yard. But at the same time, you want to get something of that, the size and the hugeness of American railroading in it.
Yeah, you don't see any 412-2s in Europe.
No.
Yeah, we have a lot of space, so we tend to spread out.
We definitely used it with some of the locomotives that we built back in the day, especially.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about too is that, at the state where I grew up in, there was a lot of like old logging railroad. And a lot of the locomotives I've built were from like logging lines. And I don't really know that I've heard of something quite like that over in Europe. There very well might be, but I haven't really heard of as many like logging railroads
No.
or I guess more temporary lines.
A
like
couple of
that.
them
And
around the Alps, but not like a logging railroad. Occasionally they will move logs, but not a specific logging layout.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think those tend to get kind of overlooked because I mean they don't tend to last as long, and they really aren't very well known. They don't tend to leave where they are.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
definitely right. A lot of the times it was literally just lay the rails, get the trees out, and then take the rails back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually a really good point. I didn't think about logging railroads at all.
In fact, a lot of logging railroads in the U.S., the track was temporary.
Mm-hmm.
Literally just rails nailed to logs going through the woods, and
Yeah.
it only had to last as long as they were able to harvest timber in that area, and that wasn't, that might have been a couple years at best.
As long as you could put a shay or a climax on it without derailing too many times, you're good.
Yeah. In fact, those locomotives were developed specifically because of that.
Exactly. An engineering marvel in itself.
Yeah.
For the second topic, and we kind of discussed it already, but great techniques to build an American layout.
Well, you'll probably need at least a little bit of space.
Yeah, space. Yeah, most difficult thing.
Yeah.
I think part of it can be, with any layout, can be expressed more in the scenery rather than anything else. Because if you I'm picturing in my head like a British layout versus like an American layout, and I think like you think about, obviously it's just the way that it is, but you think about like the tracks are generally the same, you know, the line side equipment is basically the same with just a little bit of maybe cosmetic differences. But I think the scenery is probably what sets it apart the most, because you can build mountains on a layout, but like, are you building like the high Sierras or are you building like the Appalachian coal fields?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have to really do some research and kind of really look at what you're trying to go for, and I think that helps a lot. And that's a good blanket statement for anything.
Yeah, I think probably another difference that comes to mind, specifically in the United States versus like the British one, is the size and the amount of station. Because American railroads, your points of interest are a lot further apart and you're usually a lot bigger. Whereas from what I've seen of like the Britain railroads, everything's closer together and they don't need to be as large per station because of that.
They also
good
had
point.
much smaller rolling stock.
Yeah.
But the landscape itself is much smaller, and the American landscape is a lot more bigger. The buildings themselves are a lot more bigger than the British layout, for example. And I think especially the scenery, if you're able to define American layout, it's definitely in the scenery.
It definitely makes a lot of the difference.
And
that's something that's kind of given me pause a lot of times when I've been trying to plan out what to do with my layout, because right now it's only like 12 by 10 feet. And when I look at it and think of all the stuff that I'd like to put in there, it's like, well, if I do that, it'll just end up feeling way too cramped, because every railroad that I've seen out here, there's just vast differences, not something every 10 or 20 feet. It's like, I don't know. I don't want to overstuff this.
I saw a post, I think it was for some model railroading page. It said every model railroader has had the problem of trying to fit a big yard, big scenery, big stations, and some other things on a 4x8 before. Similar situation, I think.
Yeah, and our new wider radius curves are not helping us any with that.
With the layout building, not. No.
Not helping us compact, that's for sure.
All of a sudden, we have these great curves, but now, we have to find some place to put them. I remember the first time that I got some R88 curves from ME Models, I immediately went down to the basement where I had an L shape of 4x8s, and started putting the track together, and I'm like, oh, this is way too big. I can't fit this on my layout. That's unfortunate. Sure, I'm not alone.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, like Lego trains are big to begin with. They take up a lot of room to just to start with, and then you start adding in big curves, and then you start modeling American stuff where you've got these vast distances between scenes and stuff. You run out of space very, very quick.
And the funniest thing is, you're building a 1:48 scale, I believe, with your models.
Close enough.
Yeah, and we're building 1:45, so we're actually building a bit bigger, but at the same time our scenery is a bit smaller. So we kind of have the same problem with our layouts.
And you guys have done a pretty good job, though. You guys, I'm just thinking about your guys' Lego World layouts, and those are just spectacular. At least, even that I don't really know what I'm looking at Dutch trains, but like, wow, you guys do a good job with the size of the layout. First of all, it looks interesting, and it's, at least semi-realistic with the amount of space that you have between things. So
The same
Yeah,
thing.
I definitely enjoy seeing that.
The most difficult thing is that we have every year, and I think a lot of builders will recognize that if everybody wants to build a certain piece of their layout. Somebody wants to build a harbor or a city. Somebody else wants to build a steam locomotive yard, like I did. But you need to connect those pieces, and I think that's definitely the most difficult thing if you're building a layout. If the transaction between those pieces needs to be realistic and as close to a realism as possible. Because if you're going to from a city to an entire green landscape to a forest, it isn't realistic. There needs to be some sort of transaction. And finding those transactions takes quite a lot of time, but most of the time it's in those little details which transfer your layout to the next level.
and
Oh, certainly.
But also for American layouts, I think the colors are a quite important thing. A lot of American buildings are a bit of gray or dark tan. And I think if you're going to build in more of those colors, you kind of recognize buildings more or get more realism out of them. In my opinion, that.
or concrete.
Or concrete, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to do with Lego because Lego is just bright and flashy.
Yeah, so we definitely gravitate towards the dark tans and dark grays and dark reds and all that.
Yeah, if I
The
want to
muted
model
colors.
anything, me, it's all going to be tan, dark tan, and
Reddish brown, maybe.
I don't even have
Yes.
gray rocks over here. They're all just tan and brown and red.
For the next question, this is going to be quite a difficult one. For American models, so American locomotives or wagons or any other trains, what defines them? Besides their size, the most obvious one.
I think it would be, really generic way to say it. I think it would just be the overall appearance. Just looking at any one that everybody will know, you picture like a Gresley A3, like the Flying Scotsman, and you just think about the clean cut look that locomotive produces. Like you just have the boiler, you have the wheel splashers or the wheel arches, I forget what the exact term is. Like you've got a very small cab, got huge driving wheels, and it's the loading gauge is much different. So it sits higher, but it's a much more differently proportioned locomotive. And you think about like even a comparable United States 462, you think of like a Pennsylvania K4. You have a much bigger cab. You have the Belpaire firebox, similar size drivers, but it's much taller and much longer as well. It's a lot less cleaner looking. Like you have like all the appliances on the outside. Like the differences between like vacuum brake and air pumped brakes, whatever like Westinghouse air brakes. There's a lot more appliances that you can see from the outside just looking at them. I think that's probably a big difference.
Yeah, utilitarian. Yeah, sorry, American locomotives and rolling stock tend to be more utilitarian in look. We don't try and like cover up appliances as much and hide things behind nice streamlining and everything. Everything's like right out there where it can be easily gotten to and maintained and that kind of thing. So our steam locomotives were just littered with appliances all over everything, just sticking right out there. And even today, our freight locomotives are about as utilitarian as you can get. They're boxy and you know doors everywhere and everything.
A lot of people are saying color as well, which makes a lot of sense because off the top of my head, well, the Flying Scotsman is green, and we compared to the rest of the steam locomotives that we had, we very rarely paint them in such attractive colors.
Yeah,
I
Yeah.
kind of feel like we swapped with Britain when we changed to diesels. I think British steam locomotives were all a lot more colorful than ours, but I feel like our diesels tend to have a much wider color.
Yeah, like
variety.
look at Kansas City Southern. They're all like red, black, and orange and yellow.
Yeah, once we got rid of that coal ash dirtying everything up, we could like start painting our stuff colorful colors.
Now it's just diesel. There's diesel exhaust all over the back, but
Yeah.
Good point.
I think also American locomotives are more purpose built than any others. So if you have especially steam locomotives, if they're purpose built, you can recognize if it's a passenger locomotive or a freight locomotive.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can
I agree with that.
Yeah.
definitely kind of tell them apart more. Sometimes the line is blurred a little bit. Like just thinking about Pennsylvania again, like you have the M1, which is 482. They were often used on both passenger and freight because it's basically just it's a pretty general purpose locomotive. But
Yeah.
it
And
seems
even it, I was gonna say,
most
even
of the
with
time you can tell
diesels,
them apart.
yeah, and even with diesels, like, you like like this GP7 or GP9, which you think of as like the classic American freight diesel. There was quite a lot of them that were used to pull passenger trains.
Yeah.
They were equipped with uh, for steam heating for passenger trains, and they but yeah, so
Yeah, the diesels really changed that dynamic a lot, I think.
Definitely.
Okay.
Good questions, Enrico.
Yeah, thank you. uh,
You're welcome.
the most important thing is the best place for inspiration for American topics, or American layouts, or American models.
I'd say other American layouts and models.
Just copy what's already done.
Yeah.
that's that's not a bad suggestion.
Yeah.
Oh man, it's man, that's kind of a loaded question. Like, how do you answer that? Like, it really depends on like what area of. I mean, you almost have to narrow it down to a specific area of American railroading that you're interested in, or a specific railroad, um, because we have so many different railroads, and such vast differences in terrain in the U.S.
Yeah, for
um,
me, it started out when I went out to Flagstaff, Arizona, and I saw an old logging mallee there. And that really got my interest. So for me personally, anyways, it's always just been going out and finding these old locomotives and learning about their history and where they've come from. And my plans for my layout really have come from that of getting an interest in these old logging lines or other local sceneries and stuff. So a lot of my plans are just from what I've researched from the logging railroads or going and visiting the Verde Canyon Railroad, which runs some vintage FP7s. And that's a pretty good source of inspiration too, if you can find something like that just really strikes your fancy, I guess.
yeah, and if there's if you do have a railroad that you're a specific railroad that you're interested in, one of the best resources is find out if there's a historical society for that railroad. Is there a group interested in preserving the history of that railroad? And if there is, join that group and become friends with them, because they are probably one of the best resources of information you'll have for uh, getting ideas, um, you know, figuring out like how to how things worked and everything like that.
Yeah, like you said, I
Um,
think visiting historical museums or heritage organizations kind of gives you an idea of what it's like to build a specific layout, or shows you a couple of details which really make something work. I think visiting
yeah.
and making your own pictures, uh, just going out to visit those places definitely gets the most inspiration, in my opinion. If I see for here in the
Oh
Netherlands, we
yeah.
have a couple of historical organizations which preserve steam locomotives. Just going there and have a fun day definitely keeps you
Hmm.
excited to go build your own models.
Oh yeah. Going to a museum or visiting a model railroad layout is can provide immense inspiration. Like, every time I go to a railroad museum, I usually find something like I want a model. It could be a museum across country, but I'm like, ooh, that's cool. I want to build that someday.
Yeah, and I think just for inspiration, like there are many movies out there. You kind of discussed a couple of them before we went live. A couple of American movies about trains, I believe.
It's not necessarily American, but I've always loved The Train with Burt Lancaster.
Of course.
That is a fantastic movie if you like a World War II movie largely centered around trains. And if you want to see them blow up a French rail yard.
Which is always fun to watch.
I mean, of course, really good movie. There's plenty of others as well.
For the final question, the most impressive American layout that you ever seen built in Lego, and not the Penlock layout because that's an easy one. But the most impressive one, the most impressive one of which you really thought, wow, that's definitely an American one.
Hell, you go first.
Go, you.
Oh
you
man.
We want to copy your answer.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I've got an answer. I have an answer.
All right, then you answer because I'm still thinking.
Chris, you go first.
I was just gonna copy what you guys said.
It's like high school over here.
I was gonna say the Penlog layout. That's probably the one I've spent the most time looking at. Every time you guys do a show, I look at that very closely and get ideas for what I want to do with mine. I mean, even the way I built my tables is kind of reverse engineered off of your guys' tables. So
they're very heavy.
Yes, they're very heavy. But sturdy.
Good.
I like that.
They are quite sturdy. It's one of the things that we're looking to.
They are sturdy and they're cheap.
Yeah, but they are heavy.
They are heavy.
Pick two of those three things.
Yeah.
On the table.
There's been quite a few like clubs recently that have like really stepped up their layout game. I can't remember the name escapes me at the moment, but there's a club in California that recently has been doing some really cool stuff.
Is it like Sacramento?
It might be. I know one of the guys involved in it is Carl. I might
Carl
mess up
Mahler.
the last. Yeah.
Yep, that's the same one.
Yeah, those guys have been doing some really cool stuff lately. I've loved watching them. The guys from Texas Brick Railroad, they do some really, really cool stuff.
Yeah, I like both of those.
Yeah, I remember. I don't think it's part of the main Texas Brick Railroad display, but a few years ago, I remember seeing someone who displayed with Texas Brick Railroad who had a pretty large, like a logging area, and I thought that was really nicely detailed.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I don't know whose that was, and I don't think he's part of Texas Brick because I haven't played with them very often.
Yeah,
I only saw it with them once or twice online, and so I assumed it was like a guest situation.
I can't remember his name. I've met the guy. He was at Brick World a number of years ago. But he's got some really cool stuff.
So for my answer, I have two, and then I have a non-Lego answer. So for the Lego answer, I would have to say the
we can give non-Lego answers?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna do it, but I'm gonna go first. I'd have to say for a Lego layout, the Australian guys like Bonus and who is it?
Wait, they do American?
Alexander. They have an incredible layout.
Yeah, they do. I'd have mentioned them if Enrico hadn't said US.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
That's okay. It's okay.
I missed the US. I apologize. I missed the US part. I missed that.
Wah, wah.
Yeah, I apologize.
It's fine though. There's no problem in giving a shout out to a great layout.
Absolutely.
Definitely, those Australian guys always deserve their to get mentioned about their work.
So for my non-Lego answer, I would have to say one of the biggest, one of probably the best layouts that I've ever seen, and one that I can always find something to get inspired from is probably the. Dale's gonna agree with me. Is probably the Piermont division.
Oh, Howard Zane's HO layout. Yeah. That's an amazing train layout.
If you like just a lot of Appalachian bull country and just track and trains and yards and incredible scenery, it is layout. It is such an amazing layout.
Yeah. It's definitely definitely a great layout. I was gonna say for me, for like non-Lego layout, one of my favorite layouts has always been the Franklin and South Manchester by built by George Celios.
I knew you were gonna say
that. That layout was featured prominently in the first model railroad magazine I ever read as a kid. So that was like my first exposure to the wider world of model railroading, and that layout just has I've just admired that layout ever since. The detail work on that layout is just absolutely amazing. You know, right down to it's an HO scale layout, and he's got like figures in alleys, in like the slum sections, playing cards in the alleys, and he's actually like model playing cards in HO, and it's just incredible. The scenes he sets in that layout.
There are some people who have posted some videos of it. I've noticed that they don't often run trains when they have visitors, but there is plenty of footage of that layout that you can get on posted online. So I definitely recommend that if anybody feels inclined.
Yeah.
It is definitely worth watching.
Yeah, if you're into model railroading in an urban setting, in cities, he's got some really amazing stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay, now I think it's time to answer.
That's my answer. But
do we want to answer a couple of live stream questions right now? Because we have seen quite a few interesting ones. First of all, is Glenn having a bad hair day because I can't see him?
I am, but I also just don't have a webcam.
This is an interesting one. Grass or gravel between the tracks?
Oh, for something that is iconic to American railroading.
Yeah, exactly.
Can be.
I don't know. In the past, most of our pen lug layout has had grass in between, the tracks. But I think I think I prefer gravel. Usually when you see a double main line or a triple main line or 4-track main line in the US and you look between the tracks, it's basically ballast from one side to the other, and a few weeds interspersed throughout, in between, but you don't really see, big stretches of grass.
Out along the right of way.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just not much grass in general near me, so when I go look at it, it's all just dirt and road.
Yeah, depending on which area of the U.S. you're modeling, you might not have grass at all.
That's a good one too, yeah.
There's not much.
If you're modeling in the desert, you definitely don't have grass between your tracks.
Chris is going to single-handedly take out the entirety of the tan and dark tan part selection on Bricklink when he starts building his layout.
Very probably. I'm going to make it very expensive for myself.
Another question isn't related, but a funny one. If you ever designed something with a limit switch using the Lego polarity, mechanical limit switch using the Lego polarity switch for train functions or other train buildings?
Using the polarity switch is something that I do to Well, I have it like in my Crusader. I use train motors on it, so I have to switch the polarity on
Yep.
one of those motors to get them to move the direction. I think
Same here.
hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, I've done that as well, but I haven't like used the polarity switch and anything else, any of my other builds.
Still would like to be able to have mechanically operated switches, and that would, just using power functions. But at that point, I might as well buy traditional modeling,
We had a couple
like
of
tortoise motors or whatever.
we had a couple of power switch on our Lego World layout last year, and they were quite interesting. And we, since we're using the mill system, it's easier to integrate, but it takes quite a lot of time and quite a lot of effort to properly build it. Especially if you're going to
Yeah.
use it multiple times, you don't want it to climb up or get broken, so you need to demolish your entire layout every time. So but it's a fun challenge to do.
One of the most interesting approaches I've seen is people dabbling with using like pneumatic systems to flip their switches.
Oh, I've seen those too.
Yeah, I think that probably actually could work out pretty well, but I think a lot of people try and actuate like the actual switch like clicker, which I don't think I would go that route. If I tried that, I would try and just use it to move like the point itself and just bypass the clicking mechanism, because you need so much more torque to get past that when all you're really trying to do is move a rail a half an inch.
We did it.
Yeah.
We did use that at our Lego World last year.
It makes a lot more sense if you do it the easy way.
Why not all
I like
US?
the pneumatic switch though.
Sorry. Why did
No, go
all
ahead.
USA builders build 9 wall? Sorry. Why not all USA builders build 9 wide like John Neal is propagating? That will make it so much easier to combine European and US rolling stock.
Because I want to build the way that I want to build.
Well, there goes your
Technically,
question.
he builds 10 wide.
Yeah, he does build 10 wide. And I
Um,
actually do build a lot of 9 wide.
Yeah,
It's kind
the
of a
steam
nice
locomotives
balance.
Glenn and I build both usually, at least for the bigger ones, both usually end up being 9 wide.
More recently, anyways.
Yeah.
I've got some locomotives on my desk right now that are 9 wide at the cab and the bulk of the tender.
But as far as like building prototypical to the actual Lego track gauge, I don't know. I've thought about the idea. My problem is like I have so much built up right now in 8 wide that the thought of like moving over to a new gauge or new scale is daunting. Like, and you know,
Yeah, Kayla's
you,
got like a collection of like 50 freight cars that would all need to be changed at that point. Or you could just give them all to me.
and it's not just for me. It's not just like the cars and locomotives, but also the scenery, the buildings. Everything needs to get bigger when you go to a bigger scale. Our roundhouse would need to get bigger.
Our roundhouse would need to get a lot bigger. I don't want to think about that.
It's already huge. Yeah, and also, I mean, we're straining. A lot of times, we're straining Lego motors now with the stuff we build on 8 wide.
Yeah,
To
I have
go
found
to
that case.
yeah, to go to a larger scale and build some of the stuff that we do, we're gonna have to start. We would have to start looking for motors outside of Lego. New ways to power our locomotives.
And we would basically have to use just 3D printed wheels, because we're really running out of sizes for wheels as we get up to larger scales.
And all that adds up in cost very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm already spending a fair amount of money on every locomotive that I build. I don't really, and I'm just as happy with them as I would be if I was doing 10 wide or a larger scale in general.
Yeah, and
I just don't see the point in converting when I'm happy.
The cool thing for me is, outweighing the pros and cons is I don't feel like the increase of detail or accuracy I could get by going up would really be too much more than what I have right now. Going from 6 to 8 is kind of a no-brainer, but going from 8 to 10 is I don't really see a huge gain there.
Yeah.
That's a very good way to
Um,
put it.
I mean, there's some specific cases I can think of where going to 10 would be better, and like there's a certain 440 locomotive that I want to build at one
I was
point.
just gonna say 19th century 440s would be a very would be a lot easier.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a certain 440 that I really, really want to do, and I've been struggling with like how I can build it in 8 wide, and the thought of like going up to a larger scale like 10 wide for that is somewhat appealing because that would solve a bunch of problems with that locomotive. Um,
Then you
but
have like
for
this out of scale locomotive compared to all the rest of your stuff.
Yeah, that is one of the drawbacks. But yeah, I tend to agree with Glenn. For most of the stuff I build, I'm fairly happy with what I can get at the current scale at 8 wide. I don't really feel like I need, I don't feel like that that I don't feel like I that that need to jump to a bigger scale um, really warrants. I don't. Yeah, I
Uh,
don't feel the detail warrants it, and I'm not really that bothered by the discrepancy in the track gauge compared to my models.
Yeah.
quite a fun question which has been asked in the live chat. What's the difference between 6 and 8 wide? Less room to include accurate design elements or details. Well, I agree that most of the time 6 wide models don't match the size compared to their buildings or their or minifigures for that matter. From my personal opinion, 8 wide models just fit better in scale with the minifigures or buildings that you're creating.
Definitely agree.
Yeah, yeah,
I
and
think
like from my perspective, I feel like minifigures fit better with an 8 wide scale. Um, but of course, the proportions of minifigs are really wonky anyway, so it's all subjective.
I feel
Um,
like at a 135 scale, like with if you look at like the Brickmania tanks, you're just slightly pushing with what you can get away with a minifig, standing next to like a Sherman.
Mm.
Yeah,
Basic and 135 would be roughly 10 wide if you're building trains.
hmm
Yeah, for me with like the 6 wide or even sometimes 7 wide locomotives is it gets to a point where you're kind of affecting the silhouette of it. Like a 6 wide steam engine, your pistons generally have to be out at 8 or 9 wide to get your rods and everything to work. And that, if you look at a real steam engine, the kind of the silhouette, the general shape of it is kind of like a V. They generally tend to get kind of slimmer as you go down towards the wheels and the pistons. And when you're building to like a 6 wide, the it goes out, it flares out, and you get that a lot with 8 wides too, but it's not as bad.
yeah.
It's a really good point. Actually ran into that problem yesterday. It's kind of going off of that, Chris. It's an interesting thing to think about. Like in real railroading, you have these 10-foot wide platforms riding on basically 4 feet 8-inch gauge. So I definitely see what you mean about like the slimmer profile as if you're looking at like the front, it definitely gets slimmer as you move from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where I feel like sort of the characteristics of the way it looks, just the proportions and 8 wide, we definitely go way out past that when you start putting on valve gear and the pistons, but it's a lot less noticeable, I think, from a lot of angles than it is with the 6 wide.
I agree.
just a
Yeah.
couple small questions to round everything up because we're going around the 45-minute mark. Two questions for Glenn. Glenn, first of all, what's the largest Lego locomotive you've ever made?
The largest would probably be the Pennsylvania 210-4J class that I built a couple years ago that never worked right.
Okay.
That was quite big. It was
That's
also
just
quite
an
big.
unfinished project.
It is an unfinished project. I'm gonna come back to that one. It'll be a ways down the road. That was quite a big engine.
And
I'm upset that one of those didn't get saved.
one of the most important questions, what about Thomas the Tank Engine?
What about Thomas the Tank Engine? Well, what's wrong with Thomas the Tank Engine? I'll answer that. Nothing's wrong with Thomas the Tank Engine.
Alright, and the final question, which is pointed towards me, Enrico, how many US models have you ever built? None. So, on that disappointment, thank you everybody for listening.
It's time to end.
It's time to end the show. Thank you all for joining us. We'll try to do this on a regular basis, but we can't do any promises, especially in these times, in these strange and weird times. But if we're going to do another episode, which we are going to do, we will probably let everybody know on our social media pages a couple of days in advance, another couple of hours in advance. Just make sure you have a notification button on our BMR YouTube page, because then you definitely have a notification when we upload or plan our next live stream. Well, thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you for joining, everybody. Enrico, thanks for hosting as well.
No problem.
Yes.
And I wish everybody a great night. Now, night for me, great afternoon for everybody in the US.
And good morning for the Australians.
Good morning for the Australians. I thank you everybody for listening. And goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.